The moment the palm of Marcus's hand cracked across Clara's cheek, the entire room went dead silent. The jukebox in the corner seemed to skip a beat, and the heavy smell of stale beer and fried grease hung frozen in the air. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Marcus, a 6'2" real estate heir with a track record of running people out of town, was still grinning, expecting the quiet waitress in the faded black apron to burst into tears or fall to her knees like everyone else he had ever pushed around. But Clara didn't cry. She didn't scream. Her head didn't even recoil from the force of the strike. Instead, her chin shifted half an inch, her dark gray eyes locked onto his center of mass, and before Marcus's hand could even return to his side, Clara's left palm struck his chin at a precise 45-degree angle. Simultaneously, her right leg swept his lead foot with surgical speed. In under half a second, 220 pounds of arrogant muscle slammed onto the hardwood floor with a bone-rattling crash that shook the dust off the rafters. Marcus lay there, breathless, staring up at the water-stained ceiling with glazed eyes, completely paralyzed by shock. Nobody in the Rust and Anchor had ever seen Clara move like that. To the locals of Oakhaven, a quiet coastal town where news traveled fast and secrets rusted slow, Clara was simply the soft-spoken woman who worked the night shift. She had arrived 5 years ago with a single duffel bag, a faint silver scar running along her jawline, and hands that were far too calloused for someone whose only job was carrying trays of drinks. She never talked about where she came from. She lived in a small cabin near the woods, paid her rent in cash 3 days early every month, and spent her break time sitting on the back porch of the tavern, staring out toward the misty tree line with an expression that looked like heavy iron. The tavern's owner, a 60-year-old widower named Sam, watched the whole scene unfold from behind the counter, holding a clean glass and an old white towel. Sam was a man of few words, built like an old oak tree that had weathered too many winters. When Clara first walked into his bar half a decade ago asking for a shift, any shift, Sam hadn't asked for a resume or a background check. He had looked into her eyes, recognized the distinct, heavy shadow of a person who had seen the bottom of the world, and handed her an apron. Over the years, Sam had treated Clara like his own daughter, protecting her from the rougher patrons and giving her a place where she didn't have to explain her silence. But tonight, as Marcus lay wheezing on the floor and his 2 large friends froze in absolute terror, Sam realized that Clara had been protecting him all along. Marcus's friends didn't attempt to step forward. They looked at Clara's stance, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly flexed, center of gravity lower than a mountain goat's, and slowly backed away, raising their hands in submission. Clara didn't say a word. She smoothed down her apron, picked up the shattered beer glass from the floor with bare, steady hands, and tossed the shards into the trash bin beneath the counter. Marcus struggled to his feet, coughing, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and overwhelming humiliation. He pointed a trembling finger at Clara, his voice cracking as he spat out that she didn't know who she was messing with, that his father owned half the county, and that by tomorrow morning, this trashy dive bar would be reduced to ash. Clara didn't even turn to look at him. She simply pointed toward the exit, her voice smooth and devoid of any emotion, telling him that his bill had been paid, and it was time for him to leave. When the heavy oak doors finally swung shut behind Marcus and his gang, the low hum of the tavern returned, but the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The regulars, local fishermen and mechanics who had known Sam for decades, stared at Clara as if a ghost had just walked through the room. Sam slowly set down his glass, walked around the bar, and stood beside her. He didn't ask her how she did it, nor did he ask where she had learned to drop a grown man in the blink of an eye. Instead, he softly asked if her hand hurt. Clara looked down at her right knuckle, which was slightly red, and shook her head. She told Sam she was sorry for making a scene in his establishment. Sam laughed, a low, rumbling sound that carried years of hidden fatigue, and told her that it was the best show the Rust and Anchor had seen in 20 years. However, beneath Sam's hearty chuckle, a deep wire of anxiety tightened. Marcus was not just any local bully, he was the only son of Richard Vance, a powerful developer who had spent the last 3 years trying to force Sam to sell the tavern. Richard wanted the waterfront plot to build a luxury marina and high-end condos, but Sam had repeatedly refused every offer, no matter how large. The Rust and Anchor was more than just a business to Sam, it was the last tangible connection he had to his late son, Leo, who had died a decade ago while serving overseas. Every timber in the building had been restored by Leo's hands before he deployed, and Sam had promised himself he would die before letting a bulldozer touch a single plank of it. With Marcus leaving in disgrace, Richard Vance now had all the excuse he needed to unleash total war on the small tavern. The next morning, the consequences began to ripple through Oakhaven. At 6 a.m, 2 health inspectors and a building compliance officer arrived at the Rust and Anchor with clipboard checklists and immediate shutdown orders, citing mysterious structural violations that had never been an issue in 40 years. By noon, the tavern's liquor license was temporarily suspended pending an emergency review. It was a classic corporate siege, designed to starve Sam out until he had no choice but to sign away his land. Sam sat at a corner booth, staring at the legal notices pinned to his bar door, his hands trembling slightly as he held an old black and white photograph of his son Leo in uniform. Clara walked in through the back door, carrying a bag of tools she had brought from her cabin. Seeing Sam staring blankly at the floor broke something deep inside her. For 5 years, she had deliberately chosen a life of invisibility. She had erased her past, buried her instincts, and spent every day trying to forget the person she used to be. She had believed that by living quietly, she could wash the blood off her hands and escape the shadows that followed her every step. But watching an innocent, kind old man get crushed by a wealthy tyrant made her realize that peace wasn't something you could run away to, it was something you had to stand up and defend. She pulled up a chair across from Sam and gently laid her hand over his. She asked him why he fought so hard for this building, why he didn't just take Richard Vance's millions and live comfortably for the rest of his life. Sam looked up, his eyes glassy with tears, and ran his thumb over the edge of the old photograph. He told her that when Leo was 20, before he left for his final tour, they had stood right where the bar counter was today. Leo had told him that no matter how dangerous the world got out there, knowing his father was holding down this exact spot gave him an anchor. When Leo didn't come home, Sam kept the tavern open because it was the only place left where he could still feel his son's presence. Losing the Rust and Anchor meant losing the last room where Leo's memory was still alive. Clara's jaw tightened, and a profound, agonizing shift occurred in her eyes. She reached into her pocket, pulled out an old silver dog tag attached to a faded black cord, and slowly laid it on the table next to Leo's photo. Sam stopped breathing. He looked at the dog tag, then at Clara, his hands shaking so violently he could barely pick it up. Engraved on the stainless steel was a name and a unit designation that Sam recognized instantly. It was the same specialized naval special warfare unit Leo had belonged to. Clara looked Sam in the eye, her voice dropping to a whisper filled with raw pain. She revealed that she hadn't ended up in Oakhaven by accident 5 years ago. Before she was a waitress at the Rust and Anchor, she was Lieutenant Commander Clara Vance, no relation to Richard Vance, a team leader in an elite covert maritime unit. 10 years ago, during a night operation in foreign waters, her squad was ambushed after bad intelligence trapped them in an abandoned compound. Leo was part of her tactical support team. When the building came down under heavy fire, Leo had used his own body to shield Clara and 2 other teammates from a collapsing concrete pillar. He pulled her out of the rubble, but he didn't survive his injuries. Before Leo passed away in her arms as they waited for the extraction helicopter, he handed Clara his dog tag and whispered a final request. He told her about his father back in Oakhaven, about the small bar by the water, and how his father was all alone in the world. Leo made Clara promise 2 things. First, that she would leave the war behind and find a way to live a real, peaceful life, and second, if his father ever needed help, she would go to Oakhaven and make sure Sam was never alone. When Clara was discharged 2 years later, bearing severe physical injuries and unbearable survivor's guilt, she couldn't bring herself to walk up to Sam and tell him she was the commander who had led his son into that fatal mission. She felt responsible for Leo's death. She believed that if she had read the terrain better or called for support 3 minutes earlier, Leo would still be alive. So, instead of introducing herself as Leo's commander, she took a job as a quiet waitress, watching over Sam from a distance, repairing the building in secret and protecting the man who had given her a reason to keep breathing. Sam sat in absolute silence, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as the pieces of the last 5 years fell into place. He realized why this quiet woman had worked double shifts without complaint, why she spent her weekends fixing the roof, and why she had dropped a man twice her size in a fraction of a second. She wasn't just a resilient survivor, she was the guardian angel his son had sent to keep him safe. Sam didn't offer a single word of anger or blame. He simply reached across the table, grabbed Clara's calloused hand, and thanked her for bringing his son home to him. With the truth finally laid bare, the burden of secrecy lifted from Clara's shoulders, replaced by a fierce, rekindled purpose. She wasn't going to let Richard Vance ruin Sam's life or destroy the legacy Leo had died to protect. Clara knew that Vance operated in the shadows, using local corruption, forged inspection reports, and physical intimidation to get what he wanted. But Vance had spent his whole life dealing with ordinary citizens who were afraid of his money. He had no idea he was stepping into an arena with a woman trained to dismantle complex threats under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Clara immediately went to work, not with violence, but with the cold, strategic precision that had made her an elite commander. She spent the next 48 hours gathering intelligence. She tracked down the health inspector who had issued the fraudulent shutdown notice and confronted him quietly outside his home. Using precise questions and showing him she knew exactly which unrecorded bank transfers had hit his account 3 days prior, the terrified inspector signed a sworn confession admitting that Richard Vance had paid him to fake the structural violations. Next, Clara targeted the legal machinery Vance was using to force the sale. She discovered that Vance had bribed a county official to alter the zoning maps of the waterfront district, illegally reclassifying the Rust and Anchor's property as abandoned commercial land to allow for government seizure. Clara uncovered the paper trail, securing digital copies of emails and offshore transactions that linked Vance directly to systematic extortion and municipal fraud across 3 counties. On Friday evening, Richard Vance and his son Marcus walked into the Oakhaven Town Council emergency hearing, accompanied by a team of high-priced lawyers. Vance was smiling, confident that tonight he would officially acquire the deed to the Rust and Anchor and clear the final hurdle for his multi-million-dollar marina project. The room was packed with local residents, nervous and quiet, watching Sam sit alone at the front table with his head bowed. Marcus sat beside his father, an arrogant smirk on his face, wearing a high collar to hide the dark bruising on his neck where Clara had struck him days earlier. Just as the council chairman was about to gavel the meeting to order and execute the property transfer, the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. Clara walked down the center aisle. She wasn't wearing her faded waitress apron or old work boots. She wore a crisp, dark suit, her hair pulled back tightly, carrying a thick leather briefcase. The entire room went dead silent as her measured, deliberate footsteps echoed off the walls. Vance's head lawyer stood up, scoffing, demanding to know what a local bartender was doing interrupting official town business. Clara didn't even look at the lawyer. She walked straight to the podium, connected a flash drive to the town hall projector, and pointed a remote at the screen. Instantly, high-definition documents, bank statements, recorded audio files, and the signed confession of the health inspector illuminated the wall behind the council members. Clara's voice cut through the room like a cold steel blade. She presented the evidence step by step, laying out Richard Vance's decade-long history of extortion, land theft, tax evasion, and public corruption with absolute clarity. She didn't raise her voice once. She spoke with the calm, terrifying authority of a military officer delivering an undeniable briefing. As each slide changed, Vance's face turned from smug arrogance to pale, sweat-drenched horror. His lawyers frantically leaned in, whispering that there was nothing they could do to stop this. The evidence was rock solid and already mirrored to the state attorney general's office. Marcus jumped to his feet, red-faced and panicked, shouting that Clara was lying and demanding that security throw her out. Clara turned her head slowly, looking directly into Marcus's eyes with the same cool composure she had shown in the bar. She told him calmly that if he took one step toward her, the state police officers waiting outside the auditorium door would add obstruction of justice to his arrest warrant. At that exact moment, 2 state troopers stepped through the back doors, handcuffs ready, and walked down the aisle toward the front desk. Richard Vance and his son were escorted out of the town hall in front of the entire community they had spent years terrorizing. The council chairman, pale and trembling, immediately threw out all proceedings against the Rust and Anchor, officially declaring the tavern's land rights permanent and unassailable. The room erupted into cheers, local fishermen and neighbors standing up to applaud the quiet waitress who had saved their town's historic heart without firing a single shot or throwing a single punch in that room. Later that night, the Rust and Anchor opened its doors once again. The jukebox was playing softly, warm yellow light spilled out onto the misty wooden porch, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Sam stood behind the bar, pouring drinks for longtime friends, looking 10 years younger. Clara stood by the back window, watching the waves roll gently onto the shore under the moonlight. Sam walked over, placing 2 glasses on the wooden sill. He handed one to Clara and looked out at the ocean with a deep, peaceful breath. He told her that for 10 years, he had been keeping the bar open out of grief, holding on to the past because he was terrified of letting go. But tonight, looking at the vibrant room full of people who loved this place, he realized the tavern wasn't a monument to a loss, it was a home built on love and protection. Clara took a sip from her glass, feeling the cold sea breeze against her face. The weight she had carried for 10 long years, the heavy burden of feeling responsible for a fallen comrade, finally dissolved into the midnight air. She looked at Sam, then down at the silver dog tag resting quietly against her wrist. She knew that Leo wasn't looking down with sadness or regret, he was resting easy, knowing that his commander had fulfilled her final mission and brought light back to the father he loved. As the late-night regulars slowly trickled out into the cool ocean fog, Clara stepped out onto the front porch to flip the sign on the door to closed. She paused for a moment, looking down the quiet, moonlit road that had brought her to this small town 5 years ago as a broken soldier seeking a hiding place. She realized then that true strength isn't measured by how hard you can strike or how swiftly you can bring an enemy down, it is measured by the quiet grace with which you protect the people who cannot protect themselves, and the courage it takes to build a peaceful life out of the ashes of your past.